The ambulance was already in her driveway when I stepped outside that morning, and by the time I reached her porch, Margaret Hensley was on her knees beside a stretcher, screaming a name that wasn't her husband's, because her husband had been dead for 3 years and the man they were wheeling out of that house was a stranger wearing his wedding ring. Before I tell you what happened next, I want to ask you something. If you believe in kindness, in forgiveness, in the quiet hope that people can rebuild broken things, then please take a moment to like this video, leave a comment, share it with someone who needs a little hope today, and subscribe to our channel. Our community grows stronger every time someone chooses to believe in second chances, and this story, I promise you, is about exactly that. My name is Walter Briggs, and I had lived next door to Margaret for 11 years before that morning changed everything. She was 63, sharp-tongued, fiercely independent, the kind of woman who mowed her own lawn in July heat and refused help carrying groceries even when her knees clearly protested every step. Her husband, Thomas, had passed from a heart attack while gardening, right there in the tomato bed she still refused to plant anything else in. After that, Margaret became a fortress. She smiled at neighbors, waved at the mail carrier, brought casseroles to funerals, but she let almost no one close. I used to joke with her sometimes, over the fence, the way old friends do when the ache of loneliness needs a little levity poured over it. Margaret, I'd say, if you ever need a husband for an hour, you call me. I fix faucets, I carry boxes, and I don't complain about casseroles. She'd laugh, that dry little laugh of hers, and say, only an hour, Walter? I might need you longer than that. We never meant anything serious by it. It was just two lonely people trading warmth across a chain-link fence, the kind of joke that made ordinary Tuesdays a little softer. Then came the morning with the ambulance, and the man on the stretcher, and Margaret sobbing a name I didn't recognize. I ran over, my heart hammering, and knelt beside her. The paramedics were working fast, checking vitals, and I finally understood. The man wasn't Thomas. He was her younger brother, Nathaniel, a man she hadn't spoken of in years, who had shown up unannounced 2 nights before, thin and gray and clearly unwell, asking to stay just until he got back on his feet. Margaret had let him in without telling anyone, not because she didn't trust her neighbors, but because shame has a way of locking doors from the inside. Nathaniel had struggled with addiction for over a decade. He had cycled through rehabs, burned through relationships, and disappeared from every family gathering until he became a name people stopped mentioning at dinner. Margaret, despite everything, could not turn her own blood away from her porch. That morning, his body had simply given out, exhaustion and years of hard living collapsing on him all at once. As the ambulance doors closed, Margaret grabbed my arm with a grip that surprised me, and asked if I would come with her to the hospital, because she could not sit in that waiting room alone. I said yes before she even finished the sentence. The hours in that hospital were long and quiet, filled with vending machine coffee and the particular kind of silence that settles over people bracing for bad news. Margaret told me things she had never told anyone in the neighborhood. She told me how she and Nathaniel had grown up in a house where their father drank away every ounce of peace, how she had left home at 18 to escape it, and how Nathaniel had stayed behind, absorbing blows she never had to take. She told me she had spent decades feeling guilty for surviving when he hadn't, for building a stable life while his kept crumbling. She told me that when he knocked on her door 2 nights ago, she saw not the addict everyone warned her about, but the little boy who used to hide under her bed during their father's rages. I listened. I didn't offer advice, because some pain doesn't need fixing, it just needs witnessing. The doctor eventually came out and told us Nathaniel would survive, though his body needed time to recover from the stress it had endured. Relief washed over Margaret so suddenly that she nearly collapsed into the chair beside her, and I caught her arm before she did. In that moment, something between us shifted, not romantic exactly, but something deeper than neighborly courtesy. We had crossed into the territory of real trust. Over the following weeks, I found myself at Margaret's house more often, not out of obligation, but because we had both discovered how much easier grief becomes when it is shared. I helped install a ramp for Nathaniel, who needed it temporarily while his strength returned. I fixed the leaking gutter Thomas never got around to repairing. I sat with Nathaniel some afternoons while Margaret ran errands, and I learned that beneath his rough edges was a man desperate to be forgiven, not by the world, but by his sister. He told me one afternoon, voice cracking, that he didn't expect Margaret to trust him again, that he only wanted to say sorry before whatever came next in his life, good or bad. I told him that sorry, spoken honestly, is often the beginning of every real change a person makes. Margaret and Nathaniel began talking, really talking, for the first time in over a decade. Old wounds surfaced, ugly and raw, but instead of running from them, they sat with the discomfort together. I watched a woman who had spent years building walls slowly start dismantling them, brick by brick, not because it was easy, but because love demanded it. There were setbacks. One evening, Nathaniel disappeared for several hours, and Margaret paced her kitchen convinced he had relapsed and left for good. When he returned, exhausted but sober, having simply walked to clear his head and confront old memories at their childhood church, Margaret broke down in relief so intense it frightened me. I held her that day, not as a joke about being her husband for an hour, but as a friend who refused to let her carry the weight alone. As Nathaniel's health improved, something remarkable happened in our little corner of the neighborhood. Other neighbors, once distant and unaware of Margaret's private battle, began showing up too. Mrs. Alvarez brought soup. The Whitfield boys mowed her lawn without being asked. Our small community, once a collection of polite strangers waving from driveways, slowly became something closer to family. I realized that healing, real healing, rarely happens in isolation. It happens when people choose to show up for each other, imperfectly, persistently, without waiting for a perfect moment. Nathaniel eventually entered a structured recovery program nearby, one that allowed him to stay close to Margaret while receiving the professional support he needed. The day he left for the program, Margaret stood on her porch, watching his car disappear down the street, and for the first time since Thomas's death, I saw something other than sorrow in her eyes. I saw hope, fragile but real, like the first green shoot pushing through cracked pavement. Months passed. Nathaniel called every week, sometimes just to talk about nothing in particular, other times to share small victories, 30 days sober, then 60, then 90. Margaret kept a calendar on her refrigerator, marking each milestone with a small red heart, the same way she used to mark Thomas's birthday every year. Life did not become easy, but it became honest, and honesty, I learned, is its own kind of miracle. One Sunday afternoon, nearly 8 months after that terrifying morning, Margaret invited me over for dinner, along with Nathaniel, who was visiting for the weekend, stronger now, steadier, his eyes carrying a clarity that hadn't been there before. We sat at her kitchen table, the same table where Thomas used to sit, and for the first time in years, laughter filled that house again. Margaret looked at me across the table and said, with that familiar dry humor returning to her voice, "Walter, remember when you joked about being my husband for an hour?" I nodded, smiling. She said, "I think you've given me a lot more than an hour these past months. You gave me my family back." I didn't know what to say, so I simply raised my glass and told her that showing up for people we care about was never something that needed a timer. Before we reach the end of this story, I want to ask you something meaningful. If this story touched something inside you, I'd love for you to leave a comment sharing a moment when someone showed up for you unexpectedly, or a time you found the courage to forgive someone you thought you never could. Your words matter, and they might be exactly what someone else needs to read today. Margaret never remarried, and I never expected her to. What we built wasn't a romance in the way movies often portray it, but something quieter and perhaps more enduring, a partnership rooted in showing up, in choosing each other's well-being again and again, in small daily acts of care that never demanded a title. Nathaniel eventually moved into a small apartment 2 streets over, close enough to visit often, far enough to build his own independent life. He got a steady job at a hardware store, the same one where I had bought supplies to fix Margaret's gutter that very first week. Sometimes life closes its circles in ways we never expect. If this story touched your heart even a little, please like this video, leave a meaningful comment, share it with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another emotional journey like this one. Stories like Margaret's remind us that forgiveness is rarely a single grand gesture, but 1,000 small choices to stay, to listen, to try again. They remind us that family isn't only defined by blood or by vows, but by the people who show up when everything falls apart and refuse to leave until something whole is built in its place. And sometimes, the smallest joke shared over a fence, meant only to bring a little warmth into someone's lonely afternoon, becomes the first thread in a story far bigger and far more beautiful than either person ever imagined.